She's a wildcat. The Art of Candy is available now. Check out the link in the description to find out more. Presented as an in-world scrapbook, the Simpsons Uncensored family album is a snapshot chronicle of the family's fictitious history told visually, not only through photographs but also various memorabilia, ephemera, and other documents. Going from Abe and the Bouvier ancestors through Homer and Marge's childhood, high school, marriage, and successive introduction and growing up of the kids. The book was published in 1991, meaning it only draws from the first 2 seasons of the show, which obviously severely limits what and how much it can draw from in terms of the references it can make and how it ties into Springfield and its citizens as we know them today. And that does mean there are also conflicts and contradictions with the lore presented in the show. Though The Simpsons is not really the sort of show where you should be getting too concerned with that sort of thing. Likewise, despite what the book's over-the-top blurb seems to suggest, this is not any sort of secret revealing lore book kind of thing as you might expect from a more serious show. But in terms of how well the book ties into the show, specifically the first 2 seasons, I think it's wonderful. It has a perfect balance of being made up of, I would say, tending towards mostly original content, depicting events and stuff not from the show, which is cool because then it doesn't just feel like a rehash of stuff you've already seen, but then also balancing that out with just the right amount of references to specific events and episodes that are not only fun to identify, but also make sure it feels properly connected to the show, making the book a really great supplement to the show. The writing and visual gags are funny enough, not hilarious, but always amusing, charming, and most important of all, very Simpson-y. The in-world author of this book is Marge, with her short notes written throughout. Homer and Lisa each interject once, and Bart maybe 2 or 3 times, but I think they should have used more of that, of having the rest of the family write their comments and play off each other to give the book more character and humor. Where this book really succeeds in terms of adding character and enjoyment is not the family photos, but all of the other ephemera and documents. The sheer variety and surprising amount of attention to detail is outstanding. I don't expect a lot of people to be as appreciative and delighted by this stuff, because I mean, a lot of that stuff is not meaningful or interesting. You know, matchbook covers, recipes, and just tchotchke and ephemera that's often not funny or interesting in any way. Could they all be used or done even better? Sure. And I mean, you could extend this to the entire book itself. It's all just very light novelty that's kind of meaningless beyond being fun and delightful. But does it need to be anything more than that? Is fun and delight not enough? Everyone will have their own opinion based on how much this kind of thing tickles your fancy, but I know for me, I adore this kind of thing. I find a lot of the sort of inconsequential stuff in here, even when it's not contributing anything to the depiction of the family, still adds immersion, world building, and character to Springfield, even if only in the lightest sense. And ditto, I feel a sense of delight seeing some of the stuff directly from the show, like Marge's letter to Ringo or Lisa's snowball poem. On the one hand, it's like, wow, a scrap of paper with a letter from a cartoon, who cares? I don't know, I just think it's all very fun, and that it has been done so well handled, which I would not have expected this much thought and effort to be put into something like this book. There are so many no-effort, lazy shortcuts to how they could have produced something like this as a quick way to cash in on the Simpsons craze. We've seen that sort of thing done a million times for a million franchises. In fact, the Simpsons Xmas book that came out a year before this one did just that, so I consider this family album to be very respectable and made by people who actually care about producing something genuinely cool for fans. For example, going back to Marge's letter to Ringo that I just mentioned, that she would store the letter she sent him in the album instead of Ringo's reply, it doesn't really make sense, but it's a better decision, because rather than just duplicating content from the show, we instead get to see the reverse perspective of Marge's initial letter. Also, it's basically just a plain, boring looking typed letter, but there's this little handwritten correction where she's gone back to give England a capital E, and to me, that's a perfect example of, oh my god, who cares? Well, I do, because attention to detail shows it was created by someone who takes pride in the work and has the ability to make it the best it can be. Most books are made by people who don't even care enough to get the big, important stuff right, so that someone took the time and effort to make this tiny, otherwise meaningless inclusion because they saw it as a way to add a sense of reality, contribute to Marge's characterization, and add a visual note to something otherwise very plain and boring to look at. All this just from writing the letter E. And this is something you see throughout the book. Though I will say there are 2 areas that make the thought and attention to detail harder to appreciate. The first is simply that there are more than a few careless errors, and I'm not talking about like contradictions with the show, I just mean like typos and visual mistakes. Not many by any means, but odd that they're still present given that this book has had so many printings, which I guess speaks to its success, but you'd think that those things would have been corrected. The other thing is, the design throughout this book and the illustrations of the documents and such are absolutely brilliant. The same same cannot be said for the illustrations of the photos themselves. Conceptually, the content they depict is fine. It's the actual art itself that mostly seems very rushed and amateurish, that at best is not that good to some cases of being downright bad. Now, what's interesting about that as a criticism is that everything I just said about the art can also be said about the visual quality and animation of the show itself in 1991, so I don't actually consider it a criticism against the book when the show it's based on is equally visually crude, so it's understandable and makes sense that it would be this way. I guess my point is just more, don't be expecting something visually appealing from the art. The book's only 64 pages, which would regularly make me extremely dismissive out of hand, and yes, it would absolutely be better with more pages, but as it stands, it's still surprisingly satisfying and worth it. And again, I think so much of that is just down to how well it's been handled and how much fun and delight has been packed into such a short page count. In 2005-2006, the book was released in hardcover. I haven't actually seen the hardcover, but I can't imagine there are any internal differences, with the exception of probably one caption inside that does reference the cover image, because the cover image was changed for the hardcover. I suspect that was probably due to the realization that, though funnier and more appropriate in terms of character dynamics, having a nude 10-year-old, particularly depicted in this way, is probably not the best idea for a book cover, but far worse is that, contrary to everything else I've been saying about the interior handling of the book, apparently some sort of Quidjibo was given the task of illustrating and designing the hardcover. Look at this. Oh god, speaking of biblio-monkeys creating the blurst of times, so in 2014 they announced the Simpsons Family History, and based on the description I thought it was going to be kind of like a newer version of the Family Album, so I was very excited, especially because it had 300 pages, and I mean, I guess it's somewhat conceptually similar in the sense that it presents a chronological snapshot of the family's history. However, again, where I've been praising the Family Album because of how respectable it mostly is with its effort and in being made up of all new content, and not just a lazy, worthless cash grab, yeah, well, the Simpsons Family History is not cut from the same cloth as the Family Album. Instead, it's a book of like 2-to-a-page screenshots taken directly from the show and an accompanying quote or description of the scene. Just an absolutely worthless waste of paper. Truly, worst Simpsons book ever. Thankfully, that's outshone by the number of brilliant Simpsons books, specifically Bart Simpson's Guide to Life, The Simpsons Guide to Springfield, The Simpsons Library of Wisdom series, and the Vault of Simpsonology series, all of which owe so much of their brilliance to ideas established in the Uncensored Family Album. An excellent idea that, even more impressively, has been matched and at times exceeded by excellent execution. So that's the end of the review. Feel free to leave now without missing anything important. What follows is just my Abe-style ramblings, so I didn't want to point out a lot of Easter eggs, goofs, details, etc. just because I think that's more fun to discover for yourself. However, there is one curiosity I wanted to point out. So you may recall an episode in which Marge uses a Barnacle Bill pregnancy test, which is a product also depicted in this book and has the exact same test instructions as Marge reads them in the show. It even mentions the free corncob pipe, which is a great touch. However, there are two oddities here. First, despite having the exact same text, visually, Barnacle Bill and the test are completely different in the book versus how it's depicted in the show. And as you'll recall, I mentioned this book only includes content up to Season 2, yet that episode is from Season 3. Based on the air date of that episode and the release date of this book, they were probably written around the same time, which makes me wonder, did the book take it from the script, or did the script take it from the book? Maybe even the person who came up with the gag in the writer's room or whatever was also one of the contributors to the book, I don't know. Whatever the case, it does seem a little careless that the book or show borrowed this from the other so perfectly in terms of the text, but then didn't follow through with that to make sure they matched visually, with the show and book artists each obviously not being aware of that connection. So boy, I really hope somebody got fired for that blunder.